Hello and welcome to my summary presentation for those of you who could not join us in Daejeon here on the Korean Peninsula for the conference. So let me just begin. Now, when we consider a university, what is it actually for? Profit, scholarship, scholarly pursuits, or research, or career development, or even just personal growth? And also, how do we deliver the right kind of program for matching the needs of what a university might actually be? We get all these vogue terms which can be applied to our teaching or curricula, but who is best placed and how can we actually serve the changing needs of students in higher education? So my name is Mike Brandon from Hanyang University in Seoul in South Korea. And today I want to talk about how ELT in Asia can be used as an actual model for global higher education. I want to do that based on the theme of our conference this year, which is celebrating ELT in Asia. So to get at that, I want to consider very briefly the current higher education landscape, the current paradigm in global higher education, and why I think there is a need for a big change. And then, just as a point of discussion, and I want you to come away from this presentation with this in mind, and how ELT can be used as a model for global higher education. So let me just begin with my first point on setting the idea of the higher education landscape. Higher education is in demand. It's grown by, or the number of students in tertiary education has basically doubled since the turn of the millennium. And in OECD countries, those enrolled in degree programs is up by 21% in a similar period. Also in OECD countries, 90% of people actually have a bachelor's degree. Higher education is clearly a growing industry. And in my own context, in Korea, we have 69% of adults actually have a tertiary qualification. And similarly, 42% in the United Kingdom, at least in 2017, have at least a bachelor's degree. So let's just quick look at some models of a university. Now, there's a Napoleonic model, which is more vocational. There's a Humboldtian model, which is the one we might think of when we have like the lecture and the research and the knowledge. And these are basically responses, these university models, to the post-industrial revolution in, of course, particularly the Western world, but also beyond just the countries which you may associate with the names of those models. More recently, we have the growing change that university should improve the citizenship. So we have the Numanian model, which focuses on university as personal development, personal growth, and the Deweyan model, which focuses on university as promoting active citizens in a democracy. And again, it's about not just needing skills for society, but also needing professionals or citizenship development, if you like. So we can also look at student motivation, why they go to university. It could be vocational, it could be for academic reasons, personal growth, or for the social aspects of that. Now, I've crudely applied those to the different models, but there's a general idea that are the motivations of today's students to go to into tertiary education or higher education, are they actually being met by what is delivered? Now, of course, we can say that the vocational demand is clear. At least students go to university to increase their employment. Students with a tertiary degree increase their employment chances by 28%. Similarly, using statistics from the UK, 14% of those without a degree are unemployed, compared to 3% for those who completed their degree 5 years at least in the past. And also, there's been a rise, an increasing rise in jobs that require specific types of degree. So again, certainly the vocational motivation is there for students. But more than that, there's this idea of personal development, citizenship development. As So points out that actually there's a need to, particularly in the fourth industrial revolution and etc., of all the growth of things like AI and other things associated with that, multidisciplinary approaches in the workplace. We need to develop more competent and better citizens. Also, if you take a look at many university websites, they actually promote this idea of self-development. This one I've taken from Cardiff University. If you just can take a look there, you can see that actually there is a desire for simply improving yourself as a person by going through the higher education experience. So again, the vocational, personal, and social are actually things that universities are now pushing for. The people want to get better jobs, but they also want to develop themselves. The question is, how many people go to university specifically for academic pursuits? And this is where we begin to get a contradiction, I think, in the current global higher education paradigm. And again, do people want to go to become scholars? Well, there are 1.5 million faculty members in the United States, but only of those, 44% are actually part-time. This means that only 0.4% of the population are actually in university faculty. Of that, almost just over 0.2% are actually really making a career out of that. And if you just look at the scale, this is the US, 15.8 million students in 2021, with 1.7 million new enrollees entering the university system in that year. Not many of them can even become scholars. So the actual academic motivations to go to university, I'd say maybe have become one of the weaker of the four that I've put forward. However, what type of institution do you actually work in? So this academic cultures inventory, this is just one of the questions from the example. And if you take a look at these, which ones is your institution best match? Or which ones is the university you went to? What was it like? Now, for the video, you could just pause and take a look. But I've got an idea that a lot of this was focused on dissemination of knowledge. So I think I would say that actually there's still, this is quite an old quote, but I think it still resonates. Universities are still actually focused on that Humboldtian model, which is they're promoting the skills necessarily for an academic career. The idea that a scholar trains a small group and they go on to become future scholars as well. But we don't have that system anymore. We now have large classrooms, tens of thousands of students on a single campus. Some of them, sure, want to pursue an academic career, but I would say that's very much in the minority now. And actually, because of this, because of the exam system, etc., students are kind of being coached as surface learners. They're just listening to lecture, readying themselves for an exam to get, improve their GPA or their grade or etc. And this creates an issue, I think, with that university model for what society actually needs today. Take an example from Korea, and this goes actually outside of tertiary education, but the spending on private education is growing, with English education being the highest. However, the results, because of this, because of trying to learn for the exam, demonstrates that actually there are results, but they're not as strong as the investment. So this is from Education First, saying that actually Korea ranked 36 out of 111 countries for English proficiency. And I think most learners in my experience here in Korea, they're focused on that surface learning. It's about passing the test to enter university. And I think this continues in the university system. The goal is to pass the test. It's not meeting those actual skills, personal development, or societal democratic development that actually students may desire. Instead, it's more focused on, if you like, that surface academic approach. So actually, how can we deliver this? Well, we need professional expertise. We need those who are actually able to best decide what the best curricula are. And you can see where I'm going to start going towards why ELT actually may already do this. So what happens is we end up with basically you pass out of university, you've only done surface learning to pass the test, you enter your job, and the theoretical knowledge is then pushed aside. And it's all based on the experience you pick up. And another issue is, of course, with this monodirectional system or the scholarly system, we end up with unchallengeable figures within the university. Now, this contrasts with the rest of the education system. Normally, you would have to get a bachelor's degree in a content area, and then you go into that teacher training. Now, it is possible in some OECD countries to flip into teaching relatively quickly, of only 2.5 years, but generally, we're looking at 5-6 years, getting a degree, getting a teaching qualification, and then actually getting the skills placement to get a solid teaching position. Why does this not happen at university? In fact, there's no teaching qualification necessary. In fact, many of the deliverers of education actually aren't actually qualified in education at university level. It's interesting that we have these expectations throughout the education pyramid, but it suddenly drops at university level. Under the Humboldtian model, that would make sense because it's about scholars disseminating their knowledge. But that is only to, if you like, small groups of those who wish to become future scholars as well. In fact, I would posit that we need teachers just as much in university as are needed in every other level of the education system. So with this unfortunate reality, if you like, of the fact that university, higher education has become big business, if you like, administrations want to focus on cost effectiveness. They're kind of doubling up the role. You have highly qualified researchers who are then tasked with teaching large numbers of students as well. And this creates a skills mismatch, I believe. So there's certainly a space for actually arguing that by adding in more qualified teaching staff into university would actually increase the quality of teaching and free up researchers to focus on the research output as well. And also, it would also keep more retention and achievement as well, potentially benefiting the university from the business model sense. Of course, there is a general solution of offering teacher training to existing faculty around the world. One such study showed that actually, after teacher training, PhD holders did improve their pedagogical competence, but we already have a whole field focused on pedagogical development, training, etc. I do believe that we should use this more, and this is where, of course, celebrating ELT in Asia comes in. Because what is an ESL, EFL teacher? This, in fact, I think is difficult to define. Maybe you're involved in skills-based teaching. Maybe you're looking at ESP. Maybe you're looking at applying your content degree, but you're in an international education context. So there has to be language skills involved as well. I would actually posit that in terms of English proficiency, we could make a case that native speakers don't necessarily have the necessary academic English proficiencies. Never mind that we have this new now internationalized education. I think there's a case that the elements of ESL and EFL or the skills required in it do need to be applied across the university system globally. And of course, EAP, etc. There are many approaches, and these are just some of them. There's a great diverse range, but the key thing is ESL or EFL experienced teachers generally tend to be very experienced. They're not only qualified usually in a content area, they also will be qualified in a teaching area as well and have a diverse set of experiences in actual educational delivery at different levels of the education pyramid, where curriculum design, actually viewing classes, there's a lot more pressure on the actual pedagogical delivery than there is had they only experienced just being a student in higher education and then suddenly becoming the teacher in higher education. And this is where I think ESL and EFL, just ELT in general in Asia, has actually provided this really interesting, unique system of requiring all these different qualifications and experiences to deliver the quality education. And again, just from a study on introduction of different types of education tools and educational technology, actually, if you have been trained as a teacher, you would have the best pedagogical choices to make in delivery. But actually, in higher education level, a lot of tools are delivered, but without that pedagogical knowledge and experience of delivery, without actually deciding which are the best tools to achieve the best things on a taxonomical pyramid, etc. Actually, the tools don't have that backing to actually be delivered effectively. In other words, good practice requires the field experience and the qualifications together. And I think ELT in Asia actually provides, like many, hopefully, I think many of you watching this are actually doing in your everyday practice today. Also, viewed this from 1997, which is saying there's little research on the careers of EFL, ESL teachers. ESL or EFL as a recognized field has only really started to emerge in the past decade or so, at least gaining credibility, at least. And actually, a lot more needs to be discussed and understood about what's happened in the growth of English language teaching worldwide. And I think in Asia, that's where we've seen it perhaps at its potential best, given the challenges of the region, the different cultural contexts, yet the success in delivery of English language through ESL and EFL methods has been extraordinary in this region of the world. Thus, what is an ESL, EFL teacher? I'd like to open a discussion that this actually provides, from the Asian context, a real model for how global higher education can be transformed to meet the actual needs and desires of today's higher education students. Okay, the key. So today I summarized the general global higher education landscape, the current paradigm in higher education, and looked at ELT as a potential new model for global higher education. Can ELT actually provide this kind of model? Can we learn lessons and open up a discussion about transforming global higher education by looking at ELT in Asia? That's what I'd like to bring to discussion, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. My references, and of course, we can't have an open Q&A, but if you are interested in what I've talked about today, please drop me an email, and I'd be very interested to hear your opinions and ideas on what I've presented today. So good luck in your career, and keep being a reason to celebrate ELT in